Hello, everyone. Welcome to MAP Forum. My name is Nigar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. MAP Forum is a series of talks with scholars and authors and researchers, all in early modern art and history. It is exclusively sponsored by the donations of the Friends of the Medici Archive project. So we would welcome you if you become a friend today, if you haven't joined us yet. And I will provide a link to follow, and so you can also support us. Today we have Professor Jane Stevens Crawshaw with us. She is a reader in early modern European history at Oxford Brook University. She's the author of the book titled Cleaning Up Renaissance Italy, Environmental Ideals and Urban Practice in Genoa and Venice. This book was published last year in 2023, and today she's going to give a talk on this very recent publication. Professor Stevens Crawshaw, thank you so much for joining us today, and we would be very happy to hear all about your book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to spend a couple of moments just sharing my screen because I do have some slides that I want to show to you during this talk. Let me just check. Is that showing okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great.
Well,
thank you again for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for joining me. It's a real pleasure to speak to this forum. And when I was reflecting on how to start the lecture, I was reminded that very little of my research, which, as you'll have gleaned from the title of the book, this book is about environmental management. But previously, I worked on themes relating to disease and public health, particularly thinking about plague and quarantine. So when I spend time in the archive, very little of what I read tends to be celebratory in its nature. So as and when I do stumble across something of that sort, my eye tends to be immediately drawn. And I thought that I would begin, therefore, with one of the very rare examples of something celebratory from my research, which is the account of a party. It was July 1560, and a Venetian courtesan called Donna Tiberia was planning a social gathering. Donna Tiberia was one of the honest courtesans famous amongst tourists and inhabitants of early modern Venice. And as Margaret Rosenthal has written in her account of the poet and honest courtesan Veronica Franco, who you can see on screen, the courtesan flaunted an unbridled taste for sensuous extravagance and luxuries, which elicited moralizing comments from her bedazzled observers regarding her provocative and hence disruptive sexuality. Well, word of Donna Tiberia's party had reached officials in part of the government of the Venetian Republic, and she was officially advised not to hold her party, but maybe not for the reasons that we might expect. So on Sunday, the 7th of July, Donna Tiberia received a visit from the captain of the Republic's Provveditori di Comune, which was a magistracy that had been founded in the early 14th century, with broad responsibilities, including the regulation of public space. That the visit was made by the Commune's captain, as opposed to the lower paid Fante, who was more of a servant and messenger, but often tasked with this sort of communication, indicated that the encounter was of some significance for the government officials. And this is explained in the archive records of the visit made the day after it took place. Because Donna Tiberia lived near one of the many wooden bridges which still linked the islands of this extraordinary Renaissance city in the mid-16th century. The wooden bridge in question was at San Girolamo in Cannaregio, on the northern outskirts of the city. And it was during the early modern period that the Provveditori di Comune oversaw the conversion of a number of the city's bridges from wood to stone, and also the replacement of some in wood. The publication by Tommaso Porcacci, which you can see a detail of on the slide, estimated that between public bridges and those serving private structures, that there were about 400 bridges in early modern Venice, and they were a mixture of wood and stone. And the captain explained to Donna Tiberia that the authorities feared that the anticipated group of partygoers might cause the neighborhood's still wooden bridge to collapse. The weaknesses of wooden bridges were widely recognized, both in terms of their structural integrity and the costs of their maintenance. So in 1566, just a few years after Donna Tiberia's party planning, Giacomo di Ludovico funded a stone bridge in San Marcuola on the fondamenta that leads, in fact, to San Geronimo, so very much in Donna Tiberia's neighborhood. And the cost of replacing that wooden bridge in stone was split between Giacomo di Ludovico and the Provveditori di Comune, half and half, because the government officials wrote of the comfort, benefit, and ornament of the new bridge, which it was said would benefit everyone. In part, the fact that the costs were split between private and public purses was a recognition of the fact that wooden bridges required so many frequent repairs, and these would have been undertaken at the cost of the commune. So this initiative to replace the bridge represented a potentially significant saving for this government body. So the replacement of the bridge at San Marcuola very much spanned any sort of private-public division in a way that is characteristic of the work of this government body. So in 1540, when Andrea Rizzo and his brothers sent a petition regarding a house in San Martino, they described two very old wooden posts on the wall facing their property, which they said could have served no other purpose than supporting a bridge which would have stretched from their house to the fondamenta. And the brothers claimed that this bridge was likely burnt during the fire at Rialto in 1514, and they sought to reinstate it and did so using an interesting justification. They wrote that undoubtedly replacing the bridge would be for their own benefit, but would also be in the interests of the health, the salute, of those who at night came from the Grand Canal, walked along the Calais, which was said to be full of obstacles, and had been the cause of a number of drownings. And the commune agreed, recording that this was indeed the case and granting permission for the bridge to be built. So in some ways, therefore, the intervention in Donna Tiberia's social calendar, with which I began, was in line with the broader work of the Provveditori di Comune and the government's interest in maintaining and improving key ligatures in the urban body in ways that linked the health and well-being of individuals with that of broader society. So in the light of this, you could suggest that the visit from the captain to Donna Tiberia was made regardless of her status as a courtesan. But of course, it was precisely because of the reputation and status of these women that the government expected Donna Tiberia's party to draw a crowd. And hers is the only instance that I found of the authorities being concerned that a private gathering would have such an impact on part of the city's urban fabric. This brief series of examples explores some of the considerations around the use, structure, and responsibility for bridges in early modern Venice and touches on a number of the themes that I look to explore in my book, Cleaning Up Renaissance Italy. In it, the trio of ideas that we've just heard used to describe the new bridge at San Marcuola, so of comfort, benefit, and ornament, emerge as a commonly recorded and revealing trio in relation to changes that were made to the urban fabric of cities during the 16th century. Because well-being and practical utility and beauty were closely interlinked, not least through notions of proportionality and balance. And I set out to explore these ideals in relation to the management of the natural and built environments and the impact that these were intended to have on society. One of the things that has long interested me is the way in which people were thought to be bound to their broader settings during the pre-modern period, the way in which there were correspondences between the constituent parts of the human body, so the four humours, and the elements of the natural world. These connections lay at the heart of the corpus of medical ideas that had developed from the ancient world and were retained in Europe, beyond the parameters of my study. And because of them, on the basis of these ideas, it was widely believed that environments could alter the nature of the body, shaping temperaments and behaviors and health. So seafaring men, for example, were said to be like the element they belonged to, much given to loudness and roaring. And it's in part these associations, I argue, that prompted government activities to manage urban space and natural environments. And crucially, they endowed these activities with a sort of social significance. So interventions like cleaning streets, dredging ports, managing the water supply of rivers were often intended to have social as well as medical and environmental benefits. And I'm just as interested in the relationship in reverse, which is how people were seen to have an impact on the environment of places in which they lived. So looking to explore these ideas necessitates considering public spaces of very different types, so different elements of the urban infrastructure. It necessitates exploring how dynamics of ideal and practice played out in central squares and prominent streets, alongside spaces that were much more hidden from view, so dark, narrow alleyways, and certainly in one of the two cities that I particularly consider, capacious subterranean drains. The interactions between public and private interests and behaviours emerge as significant in a variety of different contexts, ranging from the impact of a party on a nearby wooden bridge, the way in which the burning of materials might create smoke, which impacted on neighbours, the location of food stands, which might block streets, or the disposal of rubbish, which threatened to clog those structures that were considered essential to urban life, particularly those that facilitated the movement or flows of people or goods or elements around the two cities. And I explore all of these ideas in the book in the context of two ports, so Genoa and Venice. And I look to answer really three main questions, or certainly these were the three that first initiated the research. And they are, what for contemporaries did a healthy city look like in the early modern period? And why did it matter? What was the consequence of dirt, filth, broadly defined in the city? And how distinctive were these things considered to be in the context of ports? And as I mentioned, in the book, I particularly focus on Genoa and Venice, although at the outset of the research, I considered also the example of Livorno. And I think ports are a fascinating context for a study of environmental management. They each experienced a number of similar challenges as a result of siltation in bodies of water. They were recognized as being open, vulnerable to the threat of the importation of epidemic disease. And their populations were characterized by higher levels, often higher levels of mobility, which was seen to pose challenges in terms of effective governance. So a number of kind of common threads link the challenges that governments faced in managing port environments. Obviously, the physical challenges of the two cities I have chosen were different because the topography and nature of these two places is different. This is one of my favorite images of 16th century Venice, taken from that work by Tommaso Porcacci that I've already referenced. And I think what comes through so clearly is that insular structure to the city, and the way in which you can see the bridges emphasized as these essential binding ties between key sections. And you contrast this with the layout of Genoa, which is very much in keeping with this section of the coastline in Liguria, with this remarkably steep topography that made overland travel and transportation very challenging and time-consuming. Hence the significance of the port. And you can see why the Genoese authorities were so concerned with material that might pass from the urban environment into the port because of this incline on which the city is constructed. So between Venice and Genoa, there are some important environmental differences. But I think that there are also, as I say, some significant similarities. So we have these two important port environments. The cities are amongst the most populous in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries. So Genoa increases its population from around about 50,000 in the early decades of the 16th century up to just under 70,000 in the second half by about 1580. And Venice's population in 1563 was estimated at just over 178,000, having risen from about 115,000 at the turn of the century. So, obviously in neither city were the changes in population size linear. There were periods of natural disaster causing fluctuations, but overall, both cities experienced a period of demographic and urban growth during the 16th century. And in the book, I argue for population density as a driver for the intensification of concerns about cleanliness, which is not a new idea, but it hasn't tended to be the traditional explanation for the development of measures relating to the management of urban and natural environments in Renaissance Italy, where these things have more readily been attributed either to perceptions of the developed form of the Italian Renaissance state, or the shock caused by demographic crises like recurrent outbreaks of plague. So these are two locations that experience some common challenges. As I explore in the book, they respond with some strikingly similar measures. But one thing to note, I think, is that in the sources that record the actions taken to try to improve the health of the cities and their wider environments, the language that's used to justify the measures does differ between Venice and Genoa. In Venice, these activities are much more readily associated with the notion of public health that's expressed as salute comune, pubblica, or universale. So we see the reference to these sorts of concepts alongside those of comfort, utility, benefit that I mentioned in the introduction to the talk. Public health was understood to encompass a broad and interconnected range of ideas and initiatives relating to behavior and morality and cleanliness, and included both preventative and curative practices. In Genoa, though, strikingly similar measures and activities were justified with reference to public comfort, so commodo pubblico, and also, and most frequently, the need to protect the city's port. So that sense of preserving the condition of the city with its location, physically just above the port, was really what was most frequently referenced in government decisions. The concept of public health was articulated much less readily, and a greater role in Genoa was acknowledged for individuals, particularly for members of the elite, in sparking and sustaining activities in this field. So I think the comparison between these two city-states can help to rebalance the dominance of notions and the long histories of public health in historical studies, to recognize that efforts to preserve the well-being of cities might not require the frequent deployment of this term, and nor did it necessarily require the associated bureaucratic structures. So in Renaissance Italy, in a number of major cities, a health office was developed and oversaw the sorts of environmental medical measures that I'm interested in. But in Genoa, the health office was principally concerned with the administration of maritime quarantine and activities in the city, the oversight of urban health, of infrastructure and the environment was placed in the care of a government body called the Padri del Comune. So, as I say, hopefully a number of suggestive points of intersection between these two contexts, as well as some engaging differences. And the way in which I try to structure the book is largely around those common environmental challenges that I mentioned earlier that we see as characteristic of ports. So thinking about, how to maintain the most effective form of the streets, to ensure the necessary movement of people and goods and air in order to maintain a healthy environment in the streets. I think about, that similar principle of free-flowing movement through the various elements of the water supply in one of the chapters. And then concentrate in the book on an area that I want to spend a few moments this evening thinking about in a little bit more detail, which is that of the disposal of waste, and to use it as an example of the sorts of questions that particularly interest me around how environmental work was undertaken and by whom. Before I explore that in a little bit more detail, it's probably worth saying that the language of waste in the sources that survive is quite developed. It's often very specific. And so sometimes where I use this sort of more general catch-all term of waste, I might well be translating any one of these terms. I do also pick up on the description of rubbish and rubble where some of these materials are particularly specified, but it's worth, I think, having that awareness of just how specific some of the terms are in the original documents. And over the period that I concentrate on, we see an increase in the number of people employed in citywide systems to handle or move waste or other elements of the environment. And in considering who's doing this work, we certainly see evidence of what Dean Ferguson has noted in relation to his study of night soil collection, of a workforce that included sanctioned and legally recognised workers, as well as those with a decidedly irregular and sometimes uncertain legal status. And there is a real variety of individuals who are appointed to different tasks. In Venice, we see cleaners appointed. The system was organised by district in the city. So in the late 15th century, the Provveditori di Comune was instructed to take onto their books 12 rubbish disposal boats with 1 or 2 men to serve each of these, and each was responsible for serving a particular district. So there were 2 per district in the city. to clear rubbish and to remove it to the location that they were instructed to. They were expected to clean on a weekly basis, and the role of cleaning became increasingly specific over the course of the 16th century, as the task of cleaning drains, for example, was separated from that of cleaning the streets, which remained with the Nettadori. In Genoa, we don't see the same sort of publicly employed cleaning workforce developed. Instead, the government carries the same expectations that private citizens will remove their waste to appointed sites. And it's the mulettieri, the muleteers of the city, who go around collecting it. We know that in the second half of the 16th century, there were just shy of 50 muleteers licensed to work in Genoa by the Padri, who between them owns just over 100 animals. And they were expected to ensure that their carts were equipped with large cloths known as zerbini that were used to ensure that once waste had been collected, it didn't fall out onto the streets of the city again over the course of bumpy journeys to allotted sites for disposal. We know that working in these jobs on behalf of the government might be temporary. It might form just a small part of the work of a number of these groups. That was certainly the case with Genoa's mulettieri. It's also the case in Venice for the boatmen who transport waste materials. But there are also groups for whom the work of environmental management really would constitute the focus for their working lives, like Venice's Cava Canali, who are responsible for digging and dredging canals and removing the materials that are extracted. You might well have noticed already that all of these individuals that I've come across who are responsible for handling and transporting waste are male in this context, although it's clear from the regulations of domestic and occupational practices that both men and women were involved in identifying and separating waste. And there are a number of proclamations relating to the disposal of waste in streets and squares that specifically mention women, but they're not prominent in the archives. And the same is also true when we turn to another aspect of environmental management that I became really interested in, which was the system that was put in place to support the development of inventions for new environmental technology, which I want to say a little bit about now. There were in both cities a wide variety of sources of waste, but the impact of the materials on the natural environment was similar in that if these materials passed into bodies of water, they would reduce the volume and flow and lead potentially to the corruption of the air, as well as all sorts of practical issues around transportation and movement. So the issue of siltation was a common problem, and governments in both ports encouraged a culture of innovation, which utilized the early system for patenting and licensing that we know from the work of other scholars in other contexts, like Luca Mollar in the silk industry. Supplications were received in both cities by government bodies from private individuals, offering inventions for new ways to dredge ports and waterways, as well as to clear shipwrecks, and a whole host of other things like moving water at greater speed and so on. For Venice, the very careful work of Roberto Beverlieri has documented this in detail, but we have the archive of the Padri del Comune in Genoa, which sets out that a similar sort of culture was in place in that city. And in both places, we see that supplications for offering these new inventions come both from those native to their city and also those who are foreign born. And this does seem to have been a system that would allow environmental expertise developed in one port to be used to procure work in another. So despite the efforts made to put in place a sort of regular system for cleaning, to develop a culture of innovation, to refine the sort of technology that's being used in order to improve the natural environments of both ports. Exceptional interventions nevertheless became necessary periodically. And in Genoa, we have 3 very large canvases that were commissioned by the Padri del Comune with some really interesting detail of some of these large-scale exceptional periods of dredging around different sections of the port. So this one survives from 1545, this one from 1575, and then finally this one from 1596 to 7. And I've pulled out just this detail from the earliest, so there's a 1545 painting. And you can see the large scale workforce that's being employed. And actually, when you zoom in on some of the figures, both men and women are depicted on site. You can also pick out a drummer, for example, who was presumably intended to give a sort of pace to the extraction work. And whilst we don't have lists of workers from the archive for this particular period of environmental excavation, there are some that are very rich for a 1583 period of dredging, which unfortunately doesn't have a canvas. So we're not in a position of being able to match up one of these paintings with rich archival documentation. But the documentation that does survive for an equivalent activity demonstrates that these workers were sent from across Liguria in order to work on these sites. They were paid daily rates. There are lists that document name, daily rate, and the number of days that were worked. And there are women listed in these archival records. They're the lowest paid workers on site, and they only appear in one company. So the workers on site were organized by company, largely by place of origin. One of these is known as the Company of the Todeschi, and it's women who feature in that company only. But it is an unusual example of women being paid for work in the sphere of environmental management. The other thing that these paintings can give us, if we look at some of the details, is a sense of where materials were taken to once they were removed. So in Genoa, earlier decades had seen waste materials and extracted materials from the city and its port taken out to the banks of one of the largest rivers near the city, which was prone to flooding, as part of an early effort to try and combat the movement of flood waters. But there was an ongoing debate about where these materials should be placed in order to safeguard the health and environment of the city. And the government consulted a number of figures they described as expert citizens and mariners, and took advice in the light of guidance about the prevailing winds and tides. And eventually, in the later half of the 16th century, decided to return to what was described as the traditional place, which was to transport these materials out beyond the lighthouse, so in the opposite direction from the Bisagno River. And you can see that depicted in this detail of the painting here. In Venice, material which was cleared from the canals was not wasted, but was transported to a number of sites around the city and the lagoon. It was used to improve gardens. So in February 1560, for example, Giacomo Badua instructed the notary of the commune to say that he would be very happy to receive the rubbish that had been removed from an empty plot of land at San Giacomo del Orio, as well as 600 boatloads of the mud from whichever canals were being dredged for his garden at San Juan Evangelista. And the entry in the archive notes, the benefit for the government, the cost saving of transporting it a short distance within the city rather than longer distances out into the lagoon. And we also have religious institutions requesting materials that were extracted from canals for their vineyard and gardens in order to improve the soil growing conditions. At other times, these materials were indeed transported out into the lagoon, particularly to one of the islands known as San Giacomo in Paludo, named because the first convent there was said to have been developed out of a large marsh. And so there's no doubt that these materials were also used for processes of shoring up the boundaries of islands and for processes of construction and land reclamation. They're used to strengthen embankments around rivers on the mainland. And they're frequently taken to this part of the city, the Ponte di San Antonio, in the 16th century, which is an absolutely key site for the management of the environment in Venice. It's the location at which vessels were permitted to load up with ballast, and was also a site to which dredged or extracted materials were taken. So that was used on an ongoing basis. There were also instructions, for example, in the 1570s, when the fort at San Nicola del Lido was being constructed, temporarily materials were diverted in order to build up the land mass there. So despite all of these extensive efforts, in both cities, officials were constantly concerned with the placement of rubbish, waste, extracted material beyond these appointed places in both cities. They frequently had to issue instructions for vacant plots of land to be cleared of items that had been dumped. In both cities, districts were provided with communal rubbish bins, which had the form generally of a square open container. And in both cities, there were consistent problems with getting these used. So there were widespread issues in terms of the compliance and adherence with these regulations in Venice and Genoa. And it's clear that the government authorities recognise the need to monitor the conditions of the urban and natural environment in this sort of general and widespread way. But they also undoubtedly monitored some areas more closely than others. So in 1517, when the canals of Venice were said to be in such a severe state that if action was not taken, it was thought that it would soon prove impossible to dredge, that actually they were going to get beyond the point where they could use technology in order to rectify the situation. At the root of the problem was said to be both the behaviour and condition of the city's boatyards, as well as the Jewish community's behaviour in the recently established ghetto. This community, their members, were said to be throwing rubbish into the canals. It was noted that this community had not been provided with a site, one of these communal rubbish bins, when the ghetto was established. And so this was a little bit after the foundation of the ghetto, required to be rectified, but at the cost of the Jewish community. A little bit later in the 16th century, a proclamation was issued to remind those within the ghetto that they were forbidden from throwing rubbish from their balconies or into waterways. And by the 1580s, the official of the Provveditori di Comune was sent into the ghetto Nuovo to inspect various small terraces that had been erected because they were said to be causing considerable damage to the health of the city because of the accumulation of materials in the canals. So it's clear that all parts of the city were monitored in terms of rubbish disposal and the movement of waste. There were issues regarding the transgression of regulations in a widespread way, but it's also clear that particular responsibility in some moments was placed at the doorway of those whose existence in the city was more precarious than most. So having explored some of these issues around the movement in the streets, the movement of water, the movement of waste materials around the city, I end the book trying to reflect on the perceived consequences of failing to meet environmental, urban, and social ideals. And I use this image, which is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, in which we can see the Virgin and Child with the plague saints Roch and Sebastian. And I think this expresses so beautifully the intersection between piety and health and well-being, and the way in which these things were aligned with ideals of beauty and order and cleanliness. And I try to reflect on the end of the book on some of these periods of extraordinary strain in the context of different types of natural disasters. So I look at plague and storms, floods and earthquakes, and argue that rather than sparking new initiatives in this field of environmental management, what natural disasters did was to intensify discussions of human culpability and responsibility. So what I think changed as a result of these events was not necessarily the activities in the field of health and environmental management, but instead the social context of those activities. That the episodes of natural disasters reaffirmed contemporary beliefs about the impact of human behaviour on the environment, and often sparked concerns about the spaces in which groups that has been designated in some way as dangerous, in the spaces in which those groups were located. So overall, what I hope that the book draws together is what I term a social and cultural history of environment and health in two distinct but nevertheless contemporary complementary contexts. And I hope to illustrate the ways in which the governance of behaviour and the intended shaping of moral conduct intersected with the regulation of space and the environment. And to explore these things against what is a fairly stable backdrop of medical ideas, which has a mechanism for explaining this intersection between the nature of people and the nature of places. But what we see change over this period is the size and composition of these two cities. And I argue, as I mentioned at the outset, that it's this that intensifies concerns and efforts to ensure cleanliness, which is broadly conceived in this period in these two Renaissance centres. So thank you very much for being with me, and I will stop sharing at this point, shall I? And then see whether or not there are any
Thank you.
questions.
Thank you so much for sharing your wonderful work. It is a fascinating research project, and I know that this is part of even a larger project that you're working on. I personally enjoyed your talk, and the visual materials that you included in your presentation were just fascinating with the canvases and paintings. This is the time that we can have a conversation about any questions that you might have or any follow-up questions that you might have. So please write your questions in the Q&A box so that I can read them to you, so that we can have this kind of conversation. There is one question in the Q&A by one of our faithful audience. Thank you for this fascinating lecture, where the residents of the Jewish ghetto in Venice offered a safe alternative to disposing it in the canal.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And so eventually they were. I think what's really telling is that the government officials, there just seemed to have been a failure to think about how rubbish would be disposed of when the ghetto was established. And it takes some time for this issue to come to the attention of the authorities. And when they do, yeah, what is eventually put into place is a similar sort of mechanism to the one that is that exists in other, you know, squares of the city, which is one of these communal rubbish facilities. But what's different is that the community has to pay for it itself. And what's not clear is quite the mechanism of that. You know, it's not clear whether or not the community not only needs to fund it itself, but needs to organise the construction of it and so on. In the city more generally, this would have been done by the Provveditorie di Comune, and I couldn't find any record, then any sort of follow-up record of you know, that magistracy's workers then going into the ghetto. So it may well have been that the community was simply instructed to ensure that one of these was put in place, and to ensure that it was, you know, kept well maintained and so on. But you know, the difference being that needed to be done at the community's own expense, rather than this being a sort of civic, you know, part of the civic infrastructure as it was elsewhere in the city. But it must then have been served with those same boats that are collecting. I mean, I found no record of a different, you know, mechanism for things being collected. So I think then, although there was this sense of, you know, it being funded differently, it must then have been kind of served in the same way as the other rubbish containers were. So I think then, once it's set up, whilst the community would have had to have maintained it, it's then integrated into the wider structure for rubbish removal.
Thank you. I initially had this question in mind, that why out of all the other cities you chose to work on Venice and Genoa, although I could think of very, you know, reasonable, you know, ideas to pick these two cities, and you explained that perfectly. But I was also curious to know how the cultural ideals were different between the two cities that influence the policies in terms of urban design and environmental management.
Yes, I think that there certainly are those, I suppose, long-standing traditions in both cities. You know, one of the things that, you know, I absolutely need to recognize is that when I turn to this story in the 15th and 16th centuries, there have been centuries of environmental management in both places. And so you're right to say that there are practices and ideals, you know, already in place. I do think that this work around the management of the environment intensifies in the period that I'm interested in, but it certainly, you know, isn't developing from scratch. So you're absolutely right to say that there are ways of organizing this work. There will be expectations. So in Genoa, for example, there's a much greater emphasis placed on, you know, sweeping the streets every Saturday. And this is not unusual, but it's very clear that this is something that has been in place for, you know, centuries, that there is a clear expectation. It's frequently articulated, but it's also referred to in petitions and so on as being part of living well in Genoa, is that you would do this, you know, in front of your home and in front of your workshop. And so I think that there are, yes, practices that are distinct. But I guess the biggest thing is that is just how different the cities are, that there are things that are done or are not done in both places, but often for very different reasons. So in Genoa, for example, it's really dangerous to wash some of the surfaces of the streets because of the kind of steep nature of some of these roads, which could cause, you know, serious accidents, particularly with when animals are being transported, or if, you know, someone's progressing on horseback and so on. So in both places, you might see concerns about, you know, washing the streets, but they would be related to different sort of aspects of the city's topography. So I think the things that I would emphasize that are different are, first of all, you know, just the natural form of the environment, and second of all, the scale of the work that's undertaken. So the archives are very different. What you can glean about environmental management is very different. I think really interesting and complementary, but the archives in Venice are larger. Much more has been you know, studied, so we can access them in a slightly more distinct, you know, in a kind of deliberate way. But much more was destroyed there. So there are some of the documents that survive in Genoa simply don't exist in Venice, because you have more of that sort of depth of the material that has survived in Genoa. In neither city, though, has the criminal archive for the majesties related to health and environment survived for the period that I have explored. So I guess that's another point of similarity, but an important thing to point out, that
Of course,
difficult
right.
To trace. You were talking about, what are the shared ideals? Well, one of the greatest ways to explore that, would be to look at when people are really contesting these government decrees and so on. And it would have been wonderful to have been able to use criminal cases in that way, but it wasn't possible on the basis of what survived.
I understand, and the questions are coming, which proves how fascinating and interesting your talk was. George asks, in Genoa, is there a division of work between urban planning and sanitation within the Padri del Comune, or is there a mixing of functions?
So
and then thank you for your work.
That's a really interesting question, and I did try to look into this when I was working, and I think that this changes over the centuries, and that as we go through, there does seem to be more of this kind of designation of specific functions, but it was actually quite difficult. Having just said that there's that depth in the archive, I found actually that aspect of who's staffing this, who is actually being sent out by the government magistracy to undertake this work. I actually found that harder to access for Genoa than I did for Venice, where you can see quite clearly that sense of the quite specific function that's developing. So I think more mixed at the beginning. I think that some of that expertise develops over the centuries, and that the function does become more specific. But I would also caveat that by saying it was something that I did try to look into, and I wasn't as successful as I'd perhaps wanted to be. So it's a little bit tentative, I would say, the answer. But thank you for the question.
Right. Yes, the next question is by Peter. This is such a rich and useful topic. Thank you. I second that. Were any of the people responsible for dredging the port in Genoa members of guilds? I ask because among the many responsibilities of the Padri del Comune, they often oversaw and served as arbits for guilds. If not, how were they organized or overseen?
Yeah. So again, thank you for the question. There's a mixture of people who are offering these inventions, and who are then tasked with either undertaking this work themselves or organizing this work to be undertaken. By and large, this does not in Genoa seem to have been intersecting with the structure of the guilds. In Venice, undoubtedly, this is. So I think this is, again, an area that is distinctive. So we do see that guild structure being utilized much more in Venice to organize this work, whereas in Genoa, you have examples sometimes of contracts being passed down within particular families. It's probably partly worth emphasizing that obviously the scale of the work that's being undertaken is very different in terms of the dredging, because the Genoese port is that much more compact, and therefore there are multiple boats operating at any one time, but not on the scale that we see it operating in Venice, where just the network of canals necessitates a greater number of boats removing waste and dredged material and so on. And so it may well have been that it was easier to keep track of the individuals directly in the Genoese context. So it's directly through the Padri del Comune. The offices were located right on the port, and sometimes these individuals do have an official of the Padri on the boat with them. It may well have been that was more common when someone is first being employed, and that then as that sort of relationship of trust is built up, it's not totally clear on that actually, but it's much more direct with the Padre rather than working through the guilds, from what I could see.
Thank you. Tristan asks, very interesting lecture, thank you. You briefly mentioned night soil. Where was it taken once it was removed from city streets in the places you examined? Did your findings agree with Ferguson's comparative argument in this respect?
Yeah, it's another great question, and I can't really answer it. I found so little about the removal of night soil in Genoa actually. I'd love to have found more. I've got a few references to construction of public latrines and so on, but it really was something that I had hoped to be able to find out more about, partly in order to be able to test exactly that comparative argument, because I do think Ferguson's is a really interesting article, but I just didn't find out enough actually in the archive in order to be able to kind of come down on one side or the other really on that, which is a shame. I'd like to have see, I would be really interested in if others are doing work. I think it's fantastic, because I think it's an area that it would be great to know a little bit more about in practice. It's one of the essential parts of the management of an urban setting, and I think that it's definitely one that I would like to have known more about. So I'm afraid I can't answer that one very fully.
Okay, thank you. And Elizabeth Fama has a very quick and specific question about what are the ridges that the supers were expected to clean?
Yeah, so I think this is there's a lot of concern about edges and boundaries, and making sure there's a concern that that's where I suppose that there's a sort of weakness in the urban fabric. That actually, if that's not either constructed properly or maintained properly, then that's where problems develop. And so it's really thinking about the the area where the land meets the water. It's that sort of section, just making sure that that's not neglected, partly because obviously that would be the area that's first, if there's any material that's left there, that's going to go straight into the waterway. But there's also, I think, concern about if materials hit by the force of the water can potentially cause damage to the structure, and those kind of boundaries, right on the edges of waterways and cities, that is a real focus for government activity, I think. A concern that if those aren't properly maintained, then you start to get that erosion of the soil, and that can cause real structural integrity, problems with structural integrity really quite quickly.
Okay, and we have one last question in the last 2 minutes of this talk by Anna. Thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering if there was any exchange of these cleaning practices between the officials of the two cities. Is there maybe the correspondence between the provveditori, so the circulation of the practices can be seen or not?
Yeah, so I think the best example of exchange directly is in this area of technology, of inventions. So we see those moving between areas of individual states, but we do see them crossing boundaries. I haven't come across any particular correspondence akin to that. I mean, you see this a lot. My earlier project when I worked on plague and public health, there you see quite a lot of this exchange of advice and practice. And I haven't come across that. I think it's probably because of the distinctive nature, the awareness of the distinctive nature, and in lots of ways celebration of the distinctive nature of a number of these areas. Although they're dealing with similar problems, they're manifesting themselves in different ways. But yes, in the area of technology, you do see an interest in inventions, machinery that's being used, and it's offered in different areas.
Okay, thank you so much. We have 1 minute. I do have another question, but I don't want to take up too much time. I can direct that question to you. And I also invite you, if you have any further questions, you can directly ask the questions from Jane. But I would like to introduce our next week's speaker, who is Florence Forte. She's a fellow at the Medici Archive Project, and she's going to give a talk on women Latinists. Also on this Thursday at 3 p.m. New York time, so Eastern time, 3 to 5 p.m., there will be a roundtable. This is episode 2 of Renaissance Genius Roundtable that is organized by the program titled Arte de Negozio. So this will be online, and the link to the Zoom meeting is also on the Medici website, Medici Archive website. So I am just going to copy that here for those of you who would like to attend to join this meeting. If you scroll down, you will see featured projects, and then you will see Renaissance Genius September 22nd, 26th. So you can join that and watch the round table. I would like to thank you, Professor Stephen Skrasha, for joining us today, for being with us for the last hour or so, and for sharing your wonderful work with us. We hope to see you again in the future. I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us and listening to this fascinating talk. I hope you can be back next week, and I hope you can support our work by clicking on the donation link. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening. See you all next week. Bye-bye. Bye.